Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find out more about what we do at officehours.global. Our first hour is general discussion about any questions around virtual or media production. Our second hour is usually something we want to spend a little bit more time on. Today, we've got Chris Fritsche here. He's been working on our logo, and he's going to be giving us a behind the scenes of what he's done so far, and just talk through it and answer your questions about 3D modeling and what the trials and tribulations involved are. Friday, we're going to talk about logistics. So how do you get stuff out of your house, out of your office, to another state, to another country, to another continent? We're going to talk about all of those things on Friday. Saturday, of course, we have the education hour from 8 to 10, education hours. And then at 10 o'clock, we'll come back onto YouTube and we'll talk about live video inside of Keynote. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that works and show some examples of it in action. So stay tuned for that. All right. Let's jump into the questions. Bill, what do we have?
Our first one comes from Douglas Carmichael this morning, and he says, I've noticed many panelists have routed their audio directly into their Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera or ATEM instead of using an external audio device. What is the advantage of doing so?
Go ahead, Stefan.
Well, one advantage of routing your audio directly into the camera is that your audio always should be in sync with your video signal you get from that camera. There's no real advantage, I think, to go directly into the ATEM, except you run out of connections. But I think that's it. So,
go ahead, David.
In my earlier days of office hours, the advantage was economic. I didn't have all the gear needed, so I had some other stuff. I was able to put it in there. It gives me a hardware mute on the surface, and the second channel I'll still use for the Voice of God microphone when I'm doing productions and not using all the hard-hitting gear.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I use the direct USB input, but if you do use the ATEM to go in, if you go in the analog inputs, I also have a feed going into the analog inputs for backup. You can use delay in there. So if you click on the little number underneath there, it popped up in the other window here. It pops up this, and where you can adjust your delay. And you don't have that delay on any of the HDMI inputs, only on the analog mic 1 and mic 2 inputs.
Jason?
As one of the rare cases where the web presenter ended up causing some issues with my 4K switcher, I can tell you that less is more when it comes to this kind of a thing. So, yeah.
Next question.
Moving on, Scott Mueller in Germantown, New York has our next one. If I wanted to set up isolated networks for NDI, Dante, and other internet, can I use multiple USB to Ethernet adapters at the same time? I see Dante. With that, you can choose which Ethernet port to use, but I'm not quite sure how to specify which port NDI should use.
Go ahead, Doug.
So my life got a lot better when I separated Dante versus everything else. So I use two separate networks, and all my Dante network is actually on a self-assigned network. So there's no router involved at all. You just plug in a Dante device, it grabs an IP, and it just works. And I have all my PCs with two NICs in them, or I use a USB NIC on like laptops, and I set it to self-assign on that network. And once it does, it just finds it. And you can see everything on your Dante network through Dante controller. That's how you know if it's on the network or not. So there's no problems. The computer will know what network you're on if you do truly separate it and use two separate switches to do that. And I tell you, my life has been so much better when I did that the Dante traffic just lives in its own world and does its thing.
Go ahead, Rupert.
I think the kind of questions in two parts. One, firstly, about the USB adapters, and then second, about separating the traffic. You can, of course, add Ethernet adapters via USB, but, with high bandwidth real-time applications like NDI, and just depending on what else you're doing on your USB bus, I'd be worried about, either saturating that bus or just getting your true full throughput that you really need. If you've got the choice of adding USB adapters for different applications, I would try and keep your highest bandwidth applications on the onboard adapter. So if your machine has a onboard and you're adding USBs for other things, put your internet over USB and make sure you're getting your NDI or whatever you're using on the onboard if possible. As for separating, with NDI 4, a workaround to ensure it would use the right interface was to use, I think, the NDI Access Manager or Discovery Server and define in there the actual IP addresses of all your machines on the network you want it to use. Therefore, it's going to discover those NDI devices by the right IPs, therefore the right network adapter.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
I lowered my hand, but yes, it's the NDI Access Manager is the thing to kind of shape where you're sending NDI. Pop in after hours sometime. There are other NDI experts that'll gladly help out with that one.
Next question.
Next one comes to us from Tobias Maas in Minneapolis. For tomorrow's color matching session and after hours, do I need Resolve installed on a local machine? We have Video's xrite color checker.
I think that we'll have to see what you have. So ping me after this so we can make sure. But I think that unless you can handle a LUT, you won't need Resolve. We'll have to kind of do things manually. So we'll be talking about that. I think that this is our first try at this, and this will be kind of an exploration of what we're trying to figure out as far as color matching different cameras. So we're really excited that you are making it available to us to all look together at it, and we can talk through what the issues are. We may not come to the solution immediately, but we will talk through how to kind of approach the process. So stay tuned. It should be a fun little hour tomorrow. Next question.
Next one comes to us from Rupert McRae here on the panel from Dallas, Texas. Zoom has become the first video communications client to attain common criteria evaluation assurance. Though issued by the German government, this seems to have wider implications in more than 25 countries. What are the thoughts from the panel?
Rupert, what does that mean?
Well, it's a good question. In Germany, they have accredited the Zoom client at a specific version to meet the requirements of this assurance standard, and it does cover things like the robustness of the security protocols behind the scenes and
right.
and privacy concerns and all those kinds of things. But some of those regions have some tight requirements. So I think the fact that it's met this requirement has some wider benefits in maybe some other regions. Also, Zoom they publicize this mainly through their investment channels. So it's interesting that maybe that was, something that was turning off some investment, and maybe now that will turn on some investment.
Send it to people who care about paperwork. That makes sense. So anyway, I think that all of those things that make people feel like Zoom had an issue, a credibility issue related to security, mostly because so many people were watching it so closely and so many people were using it. I think they solved that a long time ago. Now it's just a matter of proving to people who need to be proven to that it's been done. It's kind of confirming the thing that we all knew for the last year. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, well, Zoom still isn't accepted in the large companies in Germany because of these former security issues from the beginning. Right. And all kind of government parts of the government won't allow to communicate via Zoom. Right. So I think it would be better they sent this to the marketing department to spread the news.
Yeah, it's probably one of those things that you end up with sales folks sending it to their folks. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was going to say I remember in those early couple months of office hours, Alex, you had said that they're probably going to end up being the most secure of the video platforms. And I think we're that way. And it's a shame that people still, they can't look past what was and start looking at today. I mean, not all the lawyers are going to show up looking like cats. And for that and for that matter, like if Zoom wanted to be like really serious, why do they let those kind of features be in the app? They should. Well, the whole discussion.
I think that obviously part of the ecosystem is for them to entertain everybody. So I think that's people use it for a lot of things other than business. So I think that's why they always put all that stuff in.
Maybe there should be a business mode where you just say strip out all the ridiculous.
That would, if that included virtual backgrounds, I would hit that button in a heartbeat. So I mean, like, Turn off ridiculous mode. All right, next question.
I want more lawyers showing up as cats. Dan Huber in Erie, Pennsylvania says,
they
Alex,
should all be cats. Like
Should
that
we,
wouldn't that mean like
assigned animals?
Automatic cat filter.
Ferrets
Yep.
and cats
What
and
would your dad
possums.
say?
Oh, he's so good. My dad would be horrified. All right.
Anyway,
This is serious business.
Dan Huber in Erie, Pennsylvania says, Alex, you talked about taking presenters' slides and always converting them to Keynote. Did you always inform them? Was there ever an issue?
Go ahead, Alex.
We started doing this about 10 years ago, something like that. And the events that I worked at, like for people like Gardner in different parts of the world, we almost never told people we were doing it. And there was never really an issue, apart from the fact they say they look nice.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Chris.
Here's the issue with not telling somebody, because if you don't inform a client what your workflow is, what will happen is they're going to come up, regardless of what you tell them or what the deadline is, they're going to come up at the last minute and go, oh, I redid my PowerPoint deck here, and then you're going to have to go, we have to like reconvert that. You have to have transparency with a client and a really firm, cutoff. And the problem is people don't want to do that. Now, if you're taking graphics and that's one of the advantage of some of the shows I've worked on where the graphics are no longer 16:9 or 4:3. They're like, 10:1. And when it's so dramatically different than what it looked like on my laptop, you can communicate to somebody, oh yeah, they're doing something fancy there. I can't really change at this point. But if it's just a deck.
And when they were super wide, were they actually Keynote? Because at that point that meant we're moving to
sometimes
to it.
Not 10:1, but I've seen 4:1 be Keynote.
Right.
Sure.
Right. Because that usually meant we were moving to a Spider or a Encore or something. Like we were not. The Keynote was, a deck was in there, but no longer part of that. But that was, to your point, part of the reason we did that was so that the Keynote deck could always go out 16:9 to the broadcast. So the Keynote deck would always stay at 16:9 and be somewhere in the. It would look like it was part of a wider piece, but we always wanted to have it still there. Go ahead, David.
Internally to the company, we'll get people that use custom fonts a lot, so that's a big gotcha. What we ask is for them to provide a PDF proof so that they can print out whatever deck they have as PDF. We can then verify that what we get this looks the same, and if there's anything missing, find it out that way.
Yeah, we would always, before we started the conversion process in PowerPoint, we'd always print a PDF. To your point, the problem we'd end up with is if we had bad fonts or a different font or something like that. We would always tell clients that, or companies that I've worked with would often tell clients that we have to conform. So we need your thing before to conform for the event. And so after you hand it to us, any changes after that are just requests. Like, our artist is now managing that, inside of that. And you can't give us a deck after, usually it was like, well, it usually wasn't a week. It was like 3 days, but 3 days before the event, after that, you could make requests like, hey, I need to change this. I need to add this slide. I need to do these things, but you can't touch it anymore because it's now part of the broadcast system, and we've now converted it to Keynote. So we can't have we can't take your deck anymore. The problem was the issue is, and I won't call out names, but usually the event teams in the company knew what we were doing. So it wasn't like the client didn't know. It was just like one of those things like submit your deck and then we'll put it into the broadcast and we're going to tune it up anyway. Like it wasn't as nefarious as it sounds, because the event team knew what it was, knew that was it, and knew why we were doing it, because the outputs were better and it looked better and it animated better, and there's a whole bunch of things about it. But I will say that PowerPoint also caught up to some degree where you could run an event. I think Microsoft realized they'd fallen way behind, and so they put better tools into it. And then we also did things like the other reason that we conform decks, and we tell people we have to conform them. They put videos into their, even in Keynote, we won't play the videos out. So if we're in we play Keynote out of something like QLab, or back in the day,
Playback Pro.
Playback Pro, and I haven't used it for so long. But those kinds of things. You have a playout deck for the videos to make sure that you get every frame, which you couldn't guarantee with Keynote or PowerPoint. So we would explain to them your deck is now completely something different than what it was when you handed it to us, and so we can't have you do anything after that. Go ahead, Chris.
2021 marks the date that late 2021 that I actually put PowerPoint back on one of my machines since Keynote was released. So yeah. it has caught up. I don't like it still, and I lost all my skills because everything's after 20 years everything's in a different place.
I always have it on a computer, but because that computer's used for conversion. Next question.
Scott Mueller in Germantown, New York is up next. He says, what do you think of the Netgear M4250 AV line of switches, specifically built for NDI and Dante? I see in addition to 10 1-gig ports, there are 2 SFP ports. What would those be best used for?
Go ahead, Jason.
Those are used for uplink. So if you want to daisy chain a bunch of these switches and you have them all work together in tandem, that's typically what you would do with them.
And Jeffrey?
As for the switch itself, it looks pretty impressive. They have the online GUI, the online GUI that you can go ahead and specify whether that's going to be a Dante or a NDI port, and be able to separate those out a little bit. Other than that, the specs are pretty much to a lot of other different types of switches right there. So that would be something that I definitely would be purchasing for my studio.
Yeah, I think that I'm looking at getting a larger switch for my home, and I've been kind of leaning between these and the Ubiquiti solutions, and because the Ubiquiti one will have a little bit more control. So while it's not quite as turnkey, it also gives me more things. It's more work on my end to put it together in the kind of the same price point. But I think I'm leaning towards the Ubiquiti, but I haven't decided yet. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's back again with this one. Do you think Epic will add native M1 support to Unreal Engine despite the Epic Apple lawsuit?
I think it's unlikely. I don't think it has to do with the lawsuit. I think it has to do with the fact that it's just a lot of work, and they have a big market in the PC side, and I think that, but I think they ignore the M1 at their peril. Because Apple's about to be a pretty big market in the AR, VR, real-time 3D. And if Epic isn't available, then Apple's just going to keep clumping on to Unity and build up a competitor that they didn't have. Unity was not really competitive with Unreal before the lawsuit. And I have a feeling this year they're going to be really competitive with Unreal because of the lawsuit, because of Unity's purchase of Weta Digital. And Apple kind of pressing on the gas. So I think that I think we may see. I mean, Epic may be fine. I mean, they've got a lot of stuff going for them, but I think that they may have gone down a bad path that we may get to watch in slow motion for the next couple of years. That they just made a bunch of bad decisions at the very top with an incredible crew and incredible technology. And I don't know if they're gonna. I don't know how quickly they'll. I mean, I was sure that they were the future before the lawsuit, and now I'm less and less sure every day. Next question.
Scott Mueller in Germantown, New York says, I can't seem to sort the participant list in ZoomISO, and it's hard to find people in a list of 200 participants. What's the easiest way to find people with raised hands when a Q&A segment happens?
Go ahead, Chris.
It's not hard to find people. It's impossible to find people. So, Scott, this is what you're going to want to do. You need to set up a companion Stream Deck setup. What I do is I've created, and I could show you in After Hours sometime, although I can't, I'm not strong in Companion. What you're going to do is you're going to set up a gallery view in your ZoomISO machine, and then you get Companion to pull the names out of that gallery view and bring them down to your Stream Deck. And because when people raise their hands, they're going to pop to the top of the gallery view. That means that the first few buttons on your Stream Deck will be the people with their hands raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey.
if you don't want to do the Stream Deck, or you can't do the Stream Deck option, and I had this problem with After Hours because people would come and go, and then there'd be like 3 David Bradys and 2 Doug Fergusons in the list. If you go down to that second tab where it has the participants and it's the full list, and I don't have it up, so I don't know the exact terms, and then they have the different boxes that you can check to go into the right screen. Up on top, there is a drop down, and in that drop down, it's like, it starts with a T. It's like tasks or something like that. And you bring that up, and that whole box will clear. And then you can actually type in the name. You got to be very specific on how you type it. So if it shows up as David Brady, just like we see right here, then you have to type it that way for it to show up. And then you can have a very limited list to go from there. It gets tougher when you get more people, for sure. And I'm really hoping that Zoom's going to fix that problem.
And I think that the other thing here is that, I mean, Zoom, you can do it with ZoomISO.
We're talking about ISO though, not Zoom, correct?
Well, the
Jeffery?
ZoomISO is the question there. Yeah. The other thing is that you may want to take a research Zoom OSC, because Zoom OSC is going to have all that information coming in. So, you know, when you really want to start going through this, Zoom OSC can see who has raised their hands, you know, and who is, you know, like that's a flag for that it can actually see. And we find that with Office Hours 2.0 specifically, that the combination of Zoom ISO and Zoom OSC are very valuable, because you can tie the two of them together. And so you could just have it say, just grab everybody who raised their hand and put them over here, you know, grab everybody who did this. You know, there's a lot more control that you'll have with Zoom OSC combined with Zoom ISO. Next question.
Next one comes from Tobias Moss in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He says, how many of you do something to warm up your voice for this early morning affair?
Go ahead, David.
Well, starting from the East Coast, I've got a couple hours advantage. So I'm talking to myself, humming, what have you. Coffee, sometimes gargle with salt water. But if I'm feeling really hoarse, I'll just sit it out. That's why I'm not here all the time.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I have the problem of it coming in right after breakfast and after just getting up and not spoken at all. So I always make some annoying sounds that I'm sure wake the neighbors up, going, and make sure you're muted before you do any of that, and then just do some vocal warm-up, just to make sure all the phlegm is cleared away.
Go ahead, Tony.
Green tea with lemon juice.
There you go. That works great. Go ahead, Bill.
I really don't do anything, but that's probably because my voice was in not what I consider top shape before I started back into Office Hours a year and a half ago, or however long it's been. But that's because I've always done voiceover work, but sporadically, and I only do clients that have been existing for me for a long time, so I wasn't regularly doing it. And it took me about 2 months of Office Hours to do what I would call getting my voice back in shape. Once it was back in shape, I kind of felt like I was somebody who'd been running my whole life, had taken a few years off. And then the first month was difficult, but as it settled in, now I'm back in shape and I can sit down without any warm up and just do my normal thing. So part of it is just how much experience you have at it.
Yeah, I don't think I do anything specific other than I generally have a coffee when I get up. So I have something warm, liquid that's kind of, and then talk to I'm usually talking for the 5:30 to 6. I'm usually in After Hours or some portion of that. So that kind of helps me do that. The other things that I know as a DJ that I did in radio a lot was, lemon juice is really powerful, and especially lemon juice with hot water and honey is really good when I had some, if I was a little hoarse. I had a problem that I was a morning show host and I went to concert. I was a music director as well. So I went to concerts every night and then did the morning show in the morning, and it was hard on so many levels. Anyway, so that was a big piece of it, was having a kind of a hoarse voice from the night before, and being able to kind of, the lemon usually kind of tightened everything up and allowed me to get through the show. If you have a cold, I know that this will sound, there's two things. One is a nutty pot, and the other is, which is you literally pour hot salty water from one nostril to the other, which will clear it out. And then during the show and commercial breaks, I would use wasabi. So it'll light you right up. It'll clear everything out, and it'll get you through your next break. And then you just hit it every once in a while, and you can get all the way through a show, even if you're totally stuffed up. Next question.
Next question comes from Lois Richter in Davis, California. She says, in our new birding show, we'll have many birder panelists who are not technically savvy regarding audio and video matters. What do you think is the minimum the show should require of each panelist?
Go ahead, David.
Well, just to keep the barrier to entry low, I would say lighting from the front headphones to isolate sound, and good framing.
Yeah, and I think it depends on what they're doing. If they're just commentating on what they're looking at, that's one piece. If they're actually, obviously, if they're showing something, there's going to be a lot more technical requirements. But their audio is always the most important thing. Remember, like if we're doing a show that's visual, we're mostly going to be looking at that visual that's coming in. So, the number one thing I would say is a microphone for that. And then, but as David said, some good lighting and a webcam. But I think that getting a good microphone, at minimum of a pile or some kind of headset mic, but if they can get something a little bit better, that would make a huge difference. Next question.
Rupert McCrae, Dallas, Texas, back in with the Integrated Systems Europe show, due to take place next month, has been postponed until May. No mention of virtual options. The show claims to be the world's leading AV and systems integration exhibition. How is this show leading the way?
Hopefully May will be far enough as far as that goes. The problem is if people didn't plan to do a virtual event at this point, there's not enough time to do it. I mean, it takes a lot of time to kind of build up the capacity to make that actually work. So I think that's the challenge, is they pushed it off. E3 has already gone completely virtual and they're in June. And so I think that, this is a continuation of the trying to hang on to something that's no longer there. And I think that they were trying to hang on a little too long. If all of these folks, if they had planned ahead of time to just go virtual, they could have been building their business to a much more scalable model in the future, all these years. Because with COVID, you had a get out of jail free card the whole time. Like, oh, we're just doing the best we can to serve our market. And what they could have been doing is using that time to build a different business model, that when the physical one came back in, the different business model would just get bigger and the physical one would keep on doing its thing and they'd run in parallel. I think that's what E3 is going to do. I think that's what E3 is trying to do, is use up the last little bit of virtualness that they can take advantage of and solidify, by giving everybody warning and letting everybody know they're going to solidify a virtual version of their show that will continue on. The physical version will come back in 2023 or whatever, most likely. But they'll have a virtual version that eventually, my guess is, will be 3 to 5 times bigger than the physical one, and make them a lot more money. And I think that's the one that's really leading the way at the moment. Next question.
James Hutchinson in Dublin, Ireland says, has anyone come across any really good 3D printable webcam mounts that help with getting the best eyeline?
Go ahead, Rupert.
On Discord, there are a couple of designs that have been shared around, mainly I think for mounting something like, I think they were originally mounting the C920 on like a back plate to mount on a glass for like a teleprompter. I think there's some designs that float around Discord on that. It's probably been iterated for the Brio, I think. I use a hardware bracket, literally a piece of hardware that I bought to mount my Brio just below the top of my monitor line here. So that gets me what I want without having to print or manufacture anything. There is also a commercial product available called the PlexiCam. We've discussed that before. I'll put links to the things that I've mentioned in the chat.
Bill?
The better webcams, typically things like the Brio and the C920 and those, have a Q20 on the unit itself. If you have that, there are plenty of friction arms and other things that can be used along with various clamps to literally mount one of those anywhere. I mean, the basic style of most of those cameras is they have something that'll sit on a laptop lid, because I know that was kind of one of the primary uses. But if you investigate a little farther, and I know it surprised me with the Brio because it has a plug in there, you have to pull it out before you get to the Q20. But if you can find the Q20, it's pretty easy.
Jeffrey?
A lot of cameras I've been getting nowadays have magnetic bottoms, and so I get these little guys right here that hang over the monitor, and they work really well. As for everything else, a lot of times I just put it on a tripod, but there are some scissor mounts that you can get for the webcam. So if you got a scissors arm, you can put that in there. Other than that, get look for flex tilt. That's Edelchrome makes the flex tilt, which is like a 3-layer thing that just collapses down. You can also tilt it forward and things like that. They have a lot of 3D designs for flex tilt, and that might help you raise the camera a little bit more. For lower.
Courtney?
Yeah, I wasn't going to mention it, but since Rupert brought up teleprompters, if you're using a teleprompter, I 3D printed this little thing that goes on the yoke of the teleprompter and then lets you raise or lower. That's just basically a Q20 captive bolt there. You can put your camera on top of that. And then you can raise it and slide it left and right on the yoke and up and down to
Now,
position.
did you model that, or did you find it somewhere?
Yeah, I modeled that from scratch. And,
What'd you model it in?
Tinkercad.
Oh, nice. Very good. That's great. That's fantastic. Next question.
Brian Becker in Charlottesville, Virginia says, looking for suggestions for remote and or cloud video editing solutions for a medium-sized shop. I know these systems get pricey quickly. We're looking for more than a standard NAS. Any solutions that folks really like and or dislike?
I mean, the one that's the most full featured is Blackbird, but it is really expensive. So you'd have to work with them to make that work. Go ahead, David.
Studio Network Solutions has a product called Evo. That's kind of a cross between a NAS and a SAN, and pretty cool. Might be something worth looking into.
Yeah, I mean, Blackbird is basically you can literally stream to the cloud, and that content is available to you immediately, and you can start editing it. It'll see closed captions. You can do all the edits. You can then from there publish to multiple outputs. But it's like, I mean, I don't remember what it was, but the numbers are really high. You have to have a big instance on AWS and everything else. We used it for a project last year, or maybe 2 years ago, and it's powerful, but it's super expensive. I don't know of any medium expensive one, so Evo would be one to check out. But if you're actually trying to do edits in the cloud, that's the only one that I've seen that really seemed to work. Next question.
Our friend Dennis Champion Walker is working on the Backstage Crew, says, my third monitor goes via my ATEM. It comes in on input 2 and the display is on HDMI out 2. There is a dotted magenta line down the left side of the image on the monitor, and the whole image is offset by about 10 pixels to the right. How do I fix this?
I think that is some kind of misconnection between what the computer is sending out versus what the ATEM is seeing going in. And so what I would do is put it through a frame converter to see if that made a difference. So, I mean, if it was me, I'd probably run it through a decimator. I don't know if you have one of those laying around to see if that works. If that works, now you know what the problem is. That the computer is sending out a slightly different frame rate or resolution or something that the ATEM doesn't expect. I would also try putting it into input 1 because it means the ATEM will switch to, it should switch to that is the native output just to see what happens. So those two things will tell you whether the ATEM and the computer output are not syncing up correctly, which is possible, especially if, I don't know whether you're using a Mac or PC. On a PC, it would be more likely that it would happen that way because PCs tend to tell the monitor what they are and Macs tend to ask. So that those are which has a whole different. They both have problems with that, but that's the kind of the way they interact. Next question.
Alex Gollner in London is up next. He says, I expect at some point that the World Health Organization will announce that COVID-19 has transitioned from being pandemic to being an endemic. How long after that day would you consider attending an event like NAB?
I go with Rupert.
I think at whatever point one stops to make that consideration, you have to take all factors into consideration. And some of those factors will be that many vendors have moved on and are now engaging digitally. And upon consideration, it probably won't be worth going.
Yeah, Jeffrey.
I'm making the plan to actually go. I had a very successful CES, and so I know how to navigate around. I feel I know how to navigate around that. That could all change tomorrow with another variant, but definitely I'm pretty comfortable being able to go to a show and get the content that I need.
Bill?
What Rupert said, basically, I just want to make sure that it's not a matter of me catching it or being taken out by it. I just don't want to be an unknowing spreader of it to anybody in my circle. So I will wait until I know from all the literature and the trusted voices that I won't be in that circumstance.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, and for me, it's not COVID anymore. I'm just not going into any more conferences. I would love to have someone, if people like Jeffrey and other people want to go, I would love to get infrastructure for them so they can stream it back to us so that we can ask questions and be part of that. So I'm excited about people who want to go. I'm not willing to spend the time on it anymore. It has nothing to do with COVID at this point. It just means that we had an incredible. I didn't even know. I've gone to conferences forever. I barely knew who Harrison consoles were. It just wasn't part of my, they were bigger when I was, just different worlds. we had a great conversation with our head of engineering and one of the partners yesterday. Like I feel like as office hours gets bigger, I don't really, we can talk to whoever we want to talk to. So I don't know if I need to go to a conference to do that anymore. Otherwise I was there hanging out with friends, and I hang out with friends every day in after hours, in office hours. So I think I've just, the things that I got out of the conferences is gone for me. So I think I'm done. Next question.
Chris Widener of Lafayette, Indiana is next. He says, with the new Rode VideoMic's go-to price point being so low, will this be a new budget recommendation for panelists mics for office hours?
I am not. Is this a brand new device? These are the little ones. Did they drop the price? Did they drop after I bought it? Not that I'm bitter. It's a little low. I mean, they're okay. They're not incredible. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, it's still a wireless mic, and it's still a Wi-Fi enabled. And I actually used a Wi-Fi enabled mic last week, and I definitely had some audio problems with some of the interviews that I did. So I'm not putting my eggs in that basket just yet.
Yeah, I mean, I would use the wireless Go's in my house, which I have. That's what I use for the cooking hours. Is I use the wireless Go's because they're easy and they're easy to set up. I find that the preamp is pretty weak, so I've just had trouble getting the volume that I'm trying to get out of it. So I haven't been super impressed with that. I think that they're valid in a very closed and controlled environment. I would never take them into a like an open area and try to use them in production. So I think that's the thing. Just from my experiences at my house, I wouldn't take them into. I wouldn't use them in production. Production. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, and you can use these as a device for your in-ear monitors.
Yeah,
maybe for that case.
I use them. That's what I do now. Is I have one is in ear and one is mic. And go back, but you still need two whole systems to do that. Because you need the transmitters. But again, I find that I don't have enough confidence in them just based on my experience of them is I wouldn't use them in production. But as a home device of me jumping in and needing a wireless, I think they're great. I think that they work perfectly. I think the cost is right. I think that, for what we use them for in a place where I'm not around a lot of RF, I think that they work great. I just don't have enough confidence in them to use them in a real environment. Next question.
Comes to us from Rupert McRae in Dallas, Texas, and he says, BBC Nature documentary The Green Planet with Sir David Attenborough features a so-called Triffid camera capturing plants moving and fighting. Thoughts from the panel? And he's got a link there.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, it certainly looks like an interesting thing here. It looks like a portable motion control rig that has this horizontal slider and then, of course, an arm. And for some reason, it looks like it's got a pan tilt head on the back end that's overhead mount, and then an underslung one on the other end, which has the camera on it down here. And it allows them to do dolly shots along with ants on the ground, or they could even program it, although I'd hate to be assigned that job of going out and tracking a plant as it grew over a long period of time, so they could do time-lapse photography and program in the movement of the camera with the movement of the plant as it grows in the field. And that's usually done in a laboratory or in a stage where they set it up to look like it's in the field. But in this case, it looks like this whole rig can be transported to the field and set up and capture it in its natural habitat.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that's interesting about the Triffid or those style of cameras is that there are things that you see in slow motion and in time lapse that you won't see in real time, that you just can't, you just don't see there. And I find time lapse to be amazing. In time lapses that we where the camera's moving are really engaging. Like we've done tons of sliders, so sliders with remote heads. So this is a remote jib, so that makes it much harder because of vibration and everything else. But but we've done ones where we have like a 25-foot slider and it just slides across, and you just have people going up and down the escalator. That's all you got to do, and it's cool, and then because it's now moving and you have dimensionality and so on and so forth. So it's a huge jump and being able to add that to a jib shot is quite a thing. And it's a very complex system, especially if something that has to work over months. I mean, you know, like when you watch something like that. I just grew a bunch of herbs. My parents-in-law gave us one of those little herb gardens on water. Takes a long time. Like, it was 6 weeks before it was a real plant, you know. And so imagine that, but in a time lapse, you know, it's someone there managing that all the time. So it's an amazing thing when they do those time lapses, especially when they're not in a lab. A lot of those ones, you'll notice it's very dark around the object. It's because they did it in the lab. You know, like they put it somewhere where they could get it going there. Doing it out in the open is really hard. Go ahead, Courtney.
Especially because you can't manage the light as sunlight as well, and
the rain, the light,
any of the natural habitat problems,
plants, the ants.
Control, you know. So you either have to shoot it at the same time every day. You know, take a series of frames at the same time every day, and that can take months. Or you have to control the lighting.
By the way, one little trick when we're talking about time lapse is shoot. If you're not doing it too long and you have enough memory, shoot video instead of time lapse. Now that you can shoot video at 4K or whatever, or even 6K or whatever, shoot video because you can use all those in between frames for motion blur. It's super cool. That's all I'm saying. Next question.
Stefan Fischer here in the panel from Würzburg, Germany, says when presenting via Keynote and Zoom under certain circumstances, the screen share menu bar is shown to the audience as a gray striped box on top or bottom of the screen. How do I make it disappear?
Go ahead, David.
The only time I've ever seen that happen is when you're sharing the entire screen rather than the output of your presentation software. So when you're in there, you toggle in, it might be under advanced sharing. You'll see all the windows that are currently running. One of them will be like program out from Keynote. You share that, and I think that should take care of that.
Yeah, you want to make sure that you're not sharing a screen at all. So in Keynote, you should share to window. That's one of the play options, is share to window. Even if you go full screen, it's considering that I'm grabbing onto this window, and then nothing should be over top of it. But what I will say is that I'd move the screen share somewhere. I guess if you only have one screen, you'd have more trouble doing that. But it should be, to David's point, it should be a window sharing that's causing that overlay to happen. Next question.
Danny Law in Malaysia is up next. He said, what would be the skill sets expected of a person if he or she is recognized as the A1, the A2, and so forth for any productions or shows?
Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, depending upon what you're doing, if you're an A1, you need to know the hardware really well. You have to be familiar with the mix panel because you'll probably be mixing. You need to know the microphones that you're using and the pickup and all that, and also to assign the A2s what they're doing. If you're working as an A2, familiarize yourself with any wireless mounts and how to mount wireless microphones on Talent, plus boom work if you're handling a boom. You need to know all of those skills, and you expect to show up with those skills. You don't ever want to be cracking open a manual on the set if you're called to the set to work with somebody else's equipment, if you're not providing your own equipment. So find out ahead of time what you're going to be working with, and download the manuals and go over them, read them from cover to cover so that you're intimately familiar with every nuance of every wireless transmitter or microphone or mount that you're going to be using.
I'll go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, if I'm going to hire you as an A1, you're responsible for the show audio. So whatever is coming in, whether it's 20 inputs or 3 inputs, you're responsible for setting up the audio and making sure the paths work, everything works, talk back to the talent works. And another thing that a lot of producers like is that you handle all the comms as well. So if there's any issues with this person needs to talk to this person, this party line needs to be made, you should be responsible for that as well. So anything audio, an A1 should have to deal with.
And that oftentimes depends on the scale of the project. So as soon as you get to a certain, like I have people that are A1s for me on small projects and A2s on large projects. I have people who are A1s, and then our only comm super. We have some people, when we get to a certain size of an event, we'll have someone that's just managing comms. They're no longer managing anything else, because there's too many people and too many belt packs and too many things. You need to pay attention to that. So I think that it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. I think that a lot of what was outlined is perfect. It's just that with scale comes, oftentimes people's roles change. One of the big requirements is that people don't get caught up in their roles. Like someone who says, "Well, I'm only an A1," I go, "Okay, well, I'm not going to hire you very often." so the people just get into this, like, this is my role and this is all I do and everything else, and you're just kind of like, okay. Next question.
Yeah, I don't think everybody. A is just audio, because there is also First AC, which is a camera assistant. Yeah. So you got to learn this stuff. It's hard. Yeah. Tony Mobley. Tony Mobley is next up from Noonan, Georgia. And he says, panel, do you have any questions for Santa Claus, Greg, tonight on Conversations with Tony Mobley?
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I thought I was pretty good this year. What's with the lump of coal?
This should be good. Greg, Greg's going to be on, and he has just the craziest setup for doing Santa Claus visits from the North Pole. And I'm really excited to see how this turns out. Go ahead, Tony.
He's upped his game. He has a new teleprompter.
Nice.
So he's going to be using it tonight.
Yeah.
So
I think
he's using primarily iPhones.
Yeah. It's going to be really fun to watch. And I think the funny thing is, I think he's going to be growing all year towards next year. So we will have seen him this year, and then next year it'll be a whole different level of stuff. Hopefully we can help be part of that. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, maybe his path of development would be interesting for the audience. So how did he start, how he's doing now, and maybe what he thinks the future will bring.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Alex.
Maybe some advice for audience wrangling. How do you deal with children or even parents that aren't playing the game, or how to keep the show moving along, especially if you've got one family looking at once, and how to handle people. So it's a bit like the equivalent of hecklers and asking for a kind of writing advice about dealing with people who don't play along correctly.
Absolutely. Next question.
Comes to us from Jason Robertshaw in Sarasota, Florida, and he says, can Jeffrey and the panel talk some about live streaming using the DJI Osmo Pocket? Any difference between Pocket 1 and Pocket 2, and any other cameras that connect directly to iOS, Android for enhanced zooming on a device?
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
So first of all, we got to clarify that the Pocket does not really technically do streaming. It's the phone that ends up doing the streaming, unless you have, there is a creator out there that has made a Raspberry Pi edition that can actually put it into a streamer, but it's more like a scrape of things. As for the cameras themselves, the real difference between the two is that this one has a 1 by 1.7 inch sensor in it, so it's a little bit bigger than the first generation Pocket. From there, as for content, like I said last week, CES, I used this fairly exclusively for a lot of the content. It works really well. It also has the content creator package where you can actually get the wireless DJI microphone to it, and it connects up a little bit better. But for the most part, both cameras do a pretty good job. And if I was to put it into a regular production, like a one-on-one interview, I would most likely not do that. I'd use cameras for that.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, and I had a question for you. Do you, Jeffrey, do you use the Wi-Fi to connect to your phone, or do you use the USB-C cable always, and the Mimo or whatever the DJI app is that controls it remotely, and then stream it with something else on your phone?
Yeah, in that case, what I was using last week was I had my secondary iPhone up, and it does a direct connection into the device. So, and I was using that simply as a confidence monitor, because these screens are way too small to see if I'm focusing in on the right spot. So, and of course, I also used it to start and stop the recordings. Although the microphone also has a really cool feature that if you press a button on it, it'll actually start then stop the recordings as well.
Next question.
Next one comes from Andre Dalla in Berlin. He says, unpacking my new MacBook Pro M1 today, which things should I install and perform first?
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, hopefully, if you've already been in the Mac ecosystem, you'll have migration assistant backups of things. The first thing I do is make sure that your old machine is imaged somewhere just in case something goes wrong. Hopefully it won't. And the upgrades have been pretty clean as far as my experience goes. Then I put away that archival background and I go through my machines and I try to look for things that I've just left there too long. Old software, particularly old operating systems and things like that could clutter up. I try to clean it as much as possible. Then I use Migration Assistant on the new, fresh, kind of cut down machine to mirror that. That should take care of all your internet settings and all the rest of the I/O things that are really a pain to have to do manually. If you've never been in the Mac system before, the Mac has a whole startup for putting your ID and your passwords and things like that in to get the basics done. So just follow their very good instructions for setting up a brand new machine.
Go ahead, Tony.
I would consider all of the fantastic iPad apps, anything that's iOS that is top notch, consider putting it on that laptop.
And Jeffrey?
I'd go a little bit slower because of the fact you're switching from Intel, you're most likely switching from Intel to M1, and do the research on each of the apps that you're putting on and see if they're doing any forward progress for M1 production, because it might work on the M1 today, but then an update tomorrow, they could stop working for some reason, security or other.
Go ahead, Jesse.
As far as installs go, I always start with Logic because while the software is small itself, all the plugins is like 100 gigs and I just want to get that kicked off early.
Yeah. I mean, the Apple Pro stuff is Apple Pro and the Apple Office stuff is probably the first things that I install on any new computer. As I just start with all of those things, and that takes half the day to kind of run the install, and then it's all the little bits and pieces after that. Next question.
Aaron Husledge in Durham, North Carolina says, what are the alternatives to Unity Connect for sending multi-channel audio at low latency from point to point?
I think that the main one the main competitor to Unity is Source Connect is the one that I've seen the most. If someone's not using almost every studio that I've worked with, I mean, there's a lot of other ones out there, and I think we've even had like Elk Audio on that they get pretty close to being able to jam with each other. The only one that I think that we have a guest coming in the next couple of weeks that's doing some really low latency stuff for jamming as well. But for high value connections, the only two that I've seen actually used in production is Unity Connect and Source Connect. Next question.
Tyler Roberts in Chambersburg says, doing a build out of a media room at my house. Our electrician is able to run speaker wire. Where is a good place to design out a Dolby Atmos capable sound system so that we can have the electrician pull the cables?
Go ahead, Alex.
Dolby have their home entertainment Dolby audio room design tool, which is available, which you can download. I have never used it, but that's in theory what it's designed for making those plans.
Yeah, definitely look at the design tool is really useful. There's a lot of diagrams of exactly the angles that you need to put the speakers at or recommended. If you don't hit them perfectly, you probably will be okay, but it definitely is a lot better if you get them the way that they were designed. If you're going to spend the money to buy all the speakers and everything else, that makes a difference. And then I'm using active speakers because I like to be able to have more control so over them as opposed to it, but it's harder to find amplifiers for that. So I think that I would think about running some signal cables with the speaker. The hardest part about cables is running them. So when you have someone going to do the run, pack on other things with it, so some signal cables or fiber or whatever to, getting it through the walls. You don't want to open the walls up again. So speaker wire is pretty limited as far as if it's the only thing you're running to that one location, you're limited to what you can do later. You're better off having some stuff, going with it, and you can figure out, you have to be kind of careful of inductance and so on and so forth, but having other things that are available at each one of those outputs will give you more flexibility 10 years from now when you decide that the speakers that you have don't work and you want something better. Next question.
Jason Robertshaw, Sarasota, Florida. He says, blinking ATEM. Live production on an ATEM Mini with a long HDMI from a laptop on input 2. It would start to blink or flicker after a couple of minutes. Moving it to input 3 or 4, no problem. I think this is the ATEM, or do we think this is the ATEM or something else?
Go ahead, Courtney.
Could be the length of your cable is a little too long. to get a solid signal in. I don't know why it would not work in 2, but it would work fine in 3 and 4. It could be the connector on the ATEM has gotten a little dirty. So when you're on a long cable, any kind of impedance in that cable, dirty connector, something noisy near it, the cable, sometimes the proximity to a USB port can cause interference. If you're near a USB 3 port, and I'm not sure whether the ATEMs are aligned close to the USB ports on the motherboard or not, can make a difference. So get a cable that is either has an amplifier in it. Usually their red mirror cables will have, they'll be unidirectional. They'll have an input and an output, and make sure you get them the right way so that the output goes into the ATEM, and that will balance the impedance and it'll give you a more solid signal of it. If it's flickering, it's probably a timing error, which means the horizontal and vertical signals are not getting to the ATEM in sync with the rest of the signals.
Next question.
Don D. Lewis in Inman, South Carolina says, what microphone is Alex Lindsay using now, and why the change from the Heil PR40?
I'm using a Neumann TLM 102. This is the same as Chris Fenwick and one step down below Bill's. You have a 103. Is that? I do
have a 103 in the voice booth, but I moved it into the voice booth and I'm using the Sennheiser now.
Okay, yeah. So I think that it sounds better than the PR40. It's also like 3 times more expensive. So it's it is a different setup. This is what I've used for my voiceovers for years, years and years and years. And I didn't use it here because I tested it relatively quickly and realized there was just too much noise in my office. At some point, I realized that Noise Assist had been released and we had tested it, and I had just not gone back to retest it. And I found that when I added Noise Assist back in, I was able to actually use this mic where I'm in my office without having a problem with it for live. And I like 2 things about it. One is I like the sound. I mean, I think it gets more of my voice, especially some of the higher end pieces to it. I also like that I don't feel like I have to be as close to it, so it's it has a, so I'm pretty much further away and I have a better frame from a video perspective than I had with the PR40. I still love the PR40 and I would still use it in a lot of environments. But I decided to test this. And the final reason that I'm not changing anytime soon is because the mount that it comes with is really low quality. It's so funny that you spend so much money on a mic and then get a mount with plastic threading. And so it took me a lot. I didn't get it perfect, the angle perfect when I put it onto my mount. So then I just kind of forced it down, and knowing that because once it was broken, it was broken. So I ordered another one and I forced this one to work. When I take this one off, I won't get to use it again. So I was like, well, I'm going to use this for a couple of weeks, and now it's really grown on me, and especially as I figure out where I like to put it and everything else. I do like the mic better, but again, it's a much more expensive mic as well. Next question.
Mitchell Hill's up next from Wilmington, Delaware, and he says, have you suffered from any COVID long-form symptoms, and how has it affected your business, if so?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yes, I have. Unfortunately, but luckily they've been mild symptoms. And strangely, the COVID freeze, the brain freeze that they refer to, seemed to make me more hyper aware of things. Like instantly I can look at Alex's setup there and see that he's dressed his wires on his light. It's like instantly there, and it's in my brain and I can see it. But not to be funny, but you need to be serious with your clients and the people you're working with. You can't have visits with people knowing that you may spread the disease. So you need to be open about it, but don't go crazy. I mean, it's manageable, and then within a few months, this will all be gone for me, anyhow.
Yeah. It's a complicated problem. I just don't interact with. I don't leave my house very often as it is. But I haven't had any. I mean, I've tested myself. I mean, I get tested a lot because I have to show up in a production. So far I haven't been tested positive. I've definitely felt little symptoms pass here and there, but I haven't. Every time I get tested, it's still negative. Next question.
Chris Widener in Lafayette, Indiana is up next. He says, with the new Rode VideoMic Go 2 ultra compact analog USB camera mount shotgun microphone price point being $99, will this be a good budget recommendation for a panelist mic for office hours?
And the reason I brought this one back up is I think he was correcting us we had gone down the wrong path of which one we were searching for. Yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, that was the wireless Go that we were talking about, but it's still in the Go set systems. As for the answer, it's not really a microphone that you want to put up to your mouth and run it that way. It's a shotgun microphone, so I would say it's probably not the best for office hours. But if you're in a pinch, maybe it would work.
I'd love to test it. I mean, it's brand new. It's coming out. I've actually used other small Rode microphones as a voiceover mic, and they actually worked pretty well. A shotgun mic can work when it's just in the right place and you use it just the right way. It can actually be a relatively good solution. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Shotgun mics are typically, first of all, I hate that term because people who are civilians think they work like shotguns, which means you can keep it 10 feet from somebody, point it toward them, and you'll get perfect audio. That just doesn't happen. There's the inverse square principle, and the farther you go from somebody, the worse your sound gets very rapidly, and it is a tremendous problem. So no matter what mic it is, getting it closer is better. I'm assuming that if you can do that with this should sound fine because most mics close up can do a decent job.
I think my big thing with shotguns is that I do think you have to have a pretty quiet environment to use a shotgun mic. So it's not something you can use everywhere to make that work.
Yeah,
okay.
And as a matter of fact, let me just mention this.
We're over time.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we are changing subjects and now moving on to talk about 3D. So we're going to be, the Wednesdays as we move forward are going to continue to be more and more dealing with 3D, visual effects, photogrammetry, AR, VR, those types of things. And so we'll be talking more and more about these on Wednesdays. And the first person up is Chris Fritsche. Hey, Chris.
Hello.
And Chris is going to walk through a little bit. Chris and I have been going back and forth for, I think, months now over the, playing with the logo. And I think that he's going to be able to kind of talk to a bunch of the, what he's done so far, the trials and tribulations a little bit, and kind of talk through that process as he's working. Go ahead and, or as he's talking to us about it, think about the questions you may have about what he's working on. And they can be very basic as well as more advanced questions to kind of dig through it. So Chris, do you want to give us an overview of what you've been doing?
Yeah, so there's several different ways to do this. I mean, I can show you guys, which would to a certain extent be boring just to sit there and watch me clicking stuff and dragging things out, or I can just kind of talk you through it and then show you some examples when I'm done.
Well, if you can talk and show us a little bit, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay. So the first I can see the panel. So who in here has actually used 3D? Just raise your hand if you have. Okay. Alex and Nick okay. So as you guys understand, in order to start something in 3D, you usually need something in 2D. And let me turn this down a little bit. And so what we did, now I'm going to have to switch back and forth between the monitor view here. So you guys will just have to bear with me. Mm-hmm. But this is what we started with. This was the office hours logo, version 5. Yeah. So when we had first started, there was
special thanks to Alex Goldner. That's Alex Goldner's version of which has become kind of the one we're using.
Yes.
But yeah, so I had a version of it, and then Alex took it and made it look better.
Yeah. So one of the things you have to learn about design work is that design is spelled CHANGE, and that usually happens each day. And kind of like what Alex is mentioning here is the first version of the logo we had, a lot of stuff was based off from that. But when you set that up and you find out next week that, wait a second, that's not the official logo, this is the official logo.
Right.
And then you go back, and what you really quickly realize, I'll go back to the camera, is that you want to set stuff up in a way that can easily be changed the next day when somebody says, I need to change this color, or that needs to have 7 spokes, not 6 spokes, things like that. So that setting up that process is one thing that you really want to put some thought process into. It's not as simple as just jumping into the 3D package, making a tube and then extracting some stuff off the ends of it. You really want to give that some thought process. And that really starts with the design. So one of the things I did here was we took this design and then I just started, you'll notice that the colors come in. I just started tearing this apart, and these are the parts that go into the 3D packages. And these are the portions of the logo that get made. So anything, obviously, that's a circle, you can just scale up. And you can scale all this stuff up, but figuring out how to get all this stuff to work and pull this apart was the challenge. So up to this point, does anybody have any questions?
I know. Keep going.
Okay, so I'll real quick. I'll just show you this. So the first thing I use is Photoshop. So I usually bring this in, mess around with it in Photoshop, tear it apart, and clean it up.
And are you saving those out as layers?
Yes, each of those are a layer, and I can bring those into the 3D packages. Generally, what happens, I'll save each layer as its own file because I only have one package that can actually look at layers. Right. Bring a PSD in.
And a lot of this is, I mean, this is something that as kind of Chris talks about it, is it's hard to kind of hack your way through 3D. So a lot of times you do have to be fairly methodical and think about that. A lot of times we called it kind of dynamic design, which is that we kept on building things that were able to be edited later, or we knew where to go back to, like, oh, we have to go back to here and then move forward again. And those things had to be fairly methodical as we kind of worked through it because, you know, again, everything's a moving target and some things take a long time to do again.
Yeah, so I worked as a locator. This was a long time ago for US West Telephone, and that's the guy who walks around and paints the ground. And I walked into a CO, which is those little brick buildings where all the phone lines run into, and there was a tech in there. He was an older guy, kind of looked like Greg a little bit, Santa Greg.
Yeah,
walked in there one day and there was a mess of telephone wires on the ground all over the place. And this guy was cutting them to certain lengths and routing them as bundles. I mean, it looked immaculate what he was doing. And I found that very fascinating.
Right.
But when you get into 3D design like this, you're kind of doing the same thing. You're having to figure out how you're going to route something and how you're going to extrude or rotate something. And to a certain extent, it's really tedious. So if you don't have that mindset, it would be like watching an audio guy just kind of plug in cables and, you know, put them in a way that not everybody's tripping over them.
Right.
Anyways, so to move on, the second program is usually Illustrator. So I'll bring the Photoshop in and then I'll just run the, forget what the tool is, but it kind of just, it takes the bitmapped image and then makes it vector.
Right.
And then from there, what happens is I usually go into a program that's called Inventor. Now, this is where things can change for you guys. So earlier, Courtney mentioned Tinkercad, and there's also Fusion 360. And I'm not sure what's on the Mac side specifically for doing CAD work. I'm on a PC, so there's a couple other Rhino and some things like that. So now the only reason I go into Inventor for design stuff is because I'm very proficient in CAD versus like a polygonal modeler. So I can whip this stuff out really fast in CAD.
Right.
But in the polygonal modeler, which will give you sub Ds, which is something we're all trying to achieve it's a little more difficult.
Right.
Then from there, I usually take it into Modo to do some renderings and then kick out an OBJ or an FBX. And then from there, working with Alex months ago, we figured out that USDZ is kind of a thing of the future. So we kicked that out for the USDZ. And then you end up with let me pull this back over here. You end up with kind of a final file that looks like this.
That looks great. It's pretty.
Now this has its own image or issues because, excuse me, this top surface isn't exactly right, but this is kind of what we were going for, is something that looked like a cast metal base with a nice shiny top that, you know, kind of has some scratches on it. So that's the end result. So I keep this up because it's something for me to achieve too, but everything starts here in Photoshop,
right,
and then moves over to Inventor. And obviously I don't have anything up here, but this is kind of the route you guys are going to take, is you're going to end up bringing that logo in, and then you're going to start mapping geometry to kind of match the logo.
It's really, you're looking from above, you're looking from that plan view to make sure that you're matching it, because one of the things we did go around back and forth, and one of the things that made it more complicated, is we want to make sure that when we looked at the logo from above, from flat above, that it matched the logo that is in 2D. so that the two of them, can kind of, because you want to be able to, in a perfect world, have it, do its animation, roll up, and then fade into the 2D logo if you wanted to, and have it feel like they're both together. And that is it can be a hard thing to do, to get both of those to kind of, fit together.
And as a designer, you want to ask as many questions as possible at this stage, because if I'm not mistaken, when this logo was originally designed, this is kind of a takeoff of the Gear Media Tech thing from like 2004.
Well, the funny thing is it's a mixture of logos. So it's a bunch of different logos that are all in one place. So
that all existed initially as just two-dimensional profiles.
Right.
So when the time came for 3D, it was like, what is this thing going to look like when it rotates? And that's been the biggest challenge, is because that was never, I don't think that was ever in mind when the 2D profile was created, what it was going to look like. Or you can correct me.
It was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So generally at this point is where you'd get kind of a napkin, sketch or something like that. And they were joking around the other day about David sketching up the office hours space, the office hours space logo on a napkin and sending that out. But, if your client or the person you're working with or yourself, it's very helpful just to kind of do some sketches like that, so you have something to go off, some sort of inspiration to go off. Otherwise, when you're trying to do this on the fly, you start seeing fillets and chamfers and things like this, and you can't get past that. You're always just looking at edges.
Can you describe what a fillet and a chamfer is for those that don't do this? It's not. You don't get it at Long John Silver's.
Let me.
It's not a fillet.
Exactly. It'll be easier just to show you here. So let's pull this up. We'll do this real quick. So I'm in Inventor. I'm hitting E for extrude. I already had a profile there, and enter, and now I've got a square. So what a chamfer is, otherwise known, what a fillet is, otherwise known as like a round edge, is when you go ahead and you grab an edge here and you just want to round that off. Okay. And typically this would be done with, a mill or something like that. Or like me, if you have a grinder, you just hit it with a grinder. So there you go. We have a round edge, but we have a sharp corner here where these two edges meet. So if you wanted to round this corner off, you would get that's where you kind of get that nice rounded corners. On the other hand, on the flip side of this, a chamfer, we use this all the time in machine shop. This is kind of where you would set this part up at a 45-degree angle, and you'd run the tool across it, and you'd get something that looked like that.
Right.
Now, it's very common in the CAD world. You have what we call, this is referred to as a sharp edge. So there's no rounding on that edge. And you will see this a lot in like a machine parts, but in most of, nature and quotation marks, you would see some sort of a round right there.
And the big thing is you're looking for a highlight. So what makes things look CG-ish is the lack of that edge. So if that edge doesn't pick up highlights, you don't see some little touch of it. And a lot of times, you have to be very careful of that edge, because long polygons, for instance, in real-time engines, long polygons like that really will create aliasing. I mean, that's when you see aliasing. It's usually along two of those lines together, really close together, that in that bevel will create a lot of aliasing in Unreal and Unity. But in visual effects, if you have what we call oversampling, that little highlight really gives you that feeling of, being real, in a way that you don't get if it's sharp. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So in a CAD environment, you're not so much worried about rendering, which inherently
because you're just trying to give people extra. Yeah.
Yeah. Because your end result is a drawing. You just need a production drawing or assembly drawings or something like that. The problem comes in, or the challenge, I should say, is when you try to reuse your CAD data, because in the futuristic world that we live in now, we can reuse that CAD data in these polygonal modeling systems, and we don't have to start from scratch. So one of the things that happens a lot is, especially for me, is I've got to then come in here and I've got to pick all these edges that these designers or engineers made. And then I've got to tell this to be, some really small, it didn't go on that one, but I've got to tell it to be some really small fillet so I can have a round on that edge, or I can bring it into the polygonal modeling system and then try to put it there. You can they also have what they call a round edge shader. So I'll go back to the camera here since I'm talking. They also have a round edge shader where you don't have to do any of that stuff. It just when you render out, you tell anything that's over a certain angle edge to just be whatever the round you want it, and it kind of fakes it.
And the challenge with that is you have to have your renderer, whatever renderer that is, has to know what that is. Like so
you
when
have
you
to stay in that software.
Yeah. So you kind of commit yourself to that that process. So if you
It's a cheat.
And especially when you start going to real-time engines, it becomes harder because the real-time engines often don't have those, those types of shaders.
Yeah, so I'll jump over here to Moto real quick and kind of show you.
And we've got a couple questions coming in, and then we'll have you jump into Moto here.
Great.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill. Let's jump.
Well, the first one is mine, and I think you explained 90% of what I was asking about, which was the tools you were using to move from that original flat bitmap to something that is more 3D and spline based. But clearly, you said Inventor is kind of your tool of choice for doing that.
I've been on Inventor since 2000, so I've been working in that program for 22 years, and I just know it. It's right. It's just my go-to, but that was my day job for 20 of those 22 years. That's the program I worked. So I bought that and I've just always stayed with it. But Fusion 360, which is free, it's a free download for everybody. It does, 90% of what Inventor does as far as modeling and stuff like that. There's some things that it does not do, but for the general stuff that you guys are going to be doing, if you're not, sending out, for manufacturing and stuff like that, you really don't need those parts. So you can kind of get a free program.
Yeah. Next question.
And then Jason Robertshaw is up next from Sarasota, Florida. And he says, at my lab, proposal to get a 3D scanner to image a bone collection, dolphins and turtle skulls and skeletons, also other specimens. Suggestions for setup and recommended products to scan watermelon-sized objects.
My answer for that, because it's a little different than what we're talking about here, because this is modeling from scratch. But we're going to talk a lot more about photogrammetry in the future. What you want is actually not necessarily a scanner. You're going to want photogrammetry for artifacts, and the reason is that the scanner is accurate but not high resolution. So it will have a series of dots that go out, and you're always going to have a little bit of, you can get very nice scans, but when you get to the very edges and all the little details, especially when you're talking about bones, there's a lot of little bits and pieces that are there that you'll suddenly, when you zoom in on it, you're going to see you're going to see the polygons, and they're not going to represent very well. Whereas with photogrammetry, what you're going to get is you're only limited by the resolution of your images. So if you have a high resolution image now, you can get cameras that are 60 megapixels, and you can take incredibly high resolution images. And this is how the Smithsonian is doing it. And they have a whole great breakdown on how they're doing the artifacts, but I believe they're doing everything with all their work is photogrammetry or photogrammetry assisted with laser scans. Now, the reason that you mix LiDAR, and this is why the iPhone becomes kind of interesting, and why we'll probably see more and more of this, is when you mix the photogrammetry with the images with the LiDAR, you have structured light, which is the LiDAR, and unstructured light, which is the imagery, and that's something that you can actually take advantage of as you go through there. So that's the thing that I would recommend thinking through. Go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to mention that I've been doing quite a lot of mixing iOS LiDAR with photogrammetry for the last 9 months. And one of the key advantages of LiDAR is that you get very accurate measurements from that. So it frees you from needing to make extensive measurements manually. And then you can use those measurements as a guide for the scaling of the photogrammetry, because the photogrammetry, even when you have a calibration object in the space, depending on the angles of the cameras, you get stretching and tearing, particularly around the edges of the space that you've been capturing. And I also wanted to mention that Chris had a whole load of terminology for folks, and just wanted to share that there's a shader is basically describing the way light bounces off a surface, and that a face or a polygon is the actual surface. And that polygon could be super tiny or it could be really big, like a sheet of paper. Right. And the corners of that polygon or face are vertices, and edges connect them. And so there's a lot of this terminology that a lot of us in 3D just take for granted, but the way those are handled differently, like a fillet and such is actual changes in the geometry and the polygon faces and where they're connecting. And the shader that he mentioned about a rounding shader is just a calculation that alters the highlights and shadows at the corners of faces. They could be actually flat, but the shader calculates light so it looks like it's curved.
Yeah, and we'll, if you have questions, like we are going to keep moving through a lot of data, and the best thing to do for everyone is we will say lots of things that you may or may not. We know that 3D for this community is a little newer. If you have questions, we probably won't be able to explain everything in detail, but what we'll do is let you just ask them. Like, if don't feel free to say, I don't know what a polygon is, or I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is, because we know that, for us, for some people who do 3D video, they don't understand what Apple ProRes is. So we'll feel free to just throw questions in, like what is a bevel, or what is, those types of things, and we'll fill them in as we go. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was going to say, answering Jason's question. So this was back in like 2004. There was a technique called white light interferometry. Do you remember that, Alex?
Yeah.
It's where they stuck little white and black dots all over an object.
Nick and I did that a long time ago with a P51. Yep.
Yeah, it was just, now we consider it old technology, but I went to SolidWorks because I thought about getting SolidWorks, and I went down there and they had the STP race car in there, and they were kind of mapping it. But we have a ferrule arm at work, and we have a scanner for it. So it's like a $50,000 scanner. There's a red laser type and a blue laser type. I think the blue, we didn't opt for the blue laser. It's supposed to be a little bit more toleranced, but we can scan an object pretty good with that stuff. And then you can bring it into a polygonal modeler, and you can do a technique, what they call is, well, now it's escaping my mind. Retopology, sorry. And what you can do is you're going to have all these little nooks and crannies and stuff, but when you retopo something, you're kind of building a square around it. So you'd have an object that's got 6 faces on it. You'd slice all that up, and then you're going to tell the object that you scan to kind of be the background mesh. And then what you do is you grab that square that you have, and you kind of compress it down onto it, and as much as you've subdivided, all that kind of tries to follow that uniformed and averaged out surface. And that's a good place to start. So you don't have to live with, all the nooks and crannies. You can kind of smooth some of that stuff out. So that might be an option to go.
Now, usually with bone and a lot of those things, the goal is to try to keep as much of that as possible. But retopoing, when you start to go to a lower resolution, getting that original data as high resolution as you possibly can is kind of the game for a lot of that stuff, because you only want to do it once. So if you can get, if you take let's say a dolphin head, you want to walk away with a couple 100 million polygons, to start with. Now you're going to decimate. Decimate means we're going to get rid of all the polygons in areas that aren't moving very much, and keep the polygons, and think of polygons kind of like pixels, and so we're going to keep all the pixels where at the edges and the corners, get rid of the other stuff. And that's the first pass over decimation. And then retopoing it means that we can get it to a much lower resolution in a parametric space. And then you can use things like normal maps, which we will talk about in the future. Won't talk about right now, or might talk a little bit, but not.
I was actually going to show some of that.
Yeah, we'll show some of that right now. But to your point though, for Jason is that photogrammetry is probably something you want to look at pretty deeply, and we're going to have Chris show a little bit more of what he's been working on, and then we'll go back to the questions. Go ahead, Chris.
I'm sorry. So Nick brought up some good questions. I hadn't jumped into Moto yet, but yes, I'm going to try to explain what some of these things are. So
don't worry too much about going through every term, just because we won't have enough time to get through what you're talking about in that way. The best thing for people to do is just ask questions if they don't know what it is.
Okay. Can I do like a 30-second thing here?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you come into this is just generic. You're going to come into a polygonal modeler, whether it's a Moto or Cinema 4D or something like this. You're going to have a mesh. So I'm going to hit 5, so I'm in mesh mode here. But when I do that, I select this whole thing. When I hit 3, I'm going into polygon. So this is the stuff Nick was mentioning. If I hit 2, I'm going into edge. If I hit 1, I'm selecting vertices. So for example, if I want to select that and throw a material on here, let's just call it test. Moto's just going to give it a color. If I go over to render this material, this is what's going to happen. You know, it's going to go through its thing. You still see this very sharp edge. Okay. That's what Alex was talking about. He doesn't want. But if I go over to this test material, they have an option down here for a rounded edge shader. I'm going to change this to like, I don't know, 1 inch. That might be too big, but now when I go to render this, you're going to see that there's some smoothing going on in this edge. There's kind of a, there's kind of like a little, it's 1 inch might be too much, but it's trying to give a little bit of curve to that edge. I probably went too high on that, but that's a lot of what you're doing. You're just kind of working on stuff like that. So we'll go back to the question. Sorry, I don't want to. I can get lost in the weeds with that stuff.
No, absolutely. We'll talk a little bit more about just beyond the basics, just the process of modeling in Modo. Hope can't hear you.
Sorry, Modo, much like Cinema 4D or Blender or something like that, it's really just a process of figuring out this thing that they call edge flow. So when you're looking at a shape, or what's a good way to put this? When you export here, let me open something.
Yeah, go ahead and show us.
It's just going to be hard. I'm going to have to go back and forth between camera here, but
that's fine.
When you, I'm going to go into this right here because I have both of these up. So I'm kind of working on this thing as a sub D component, which was that gray mesh. This is kind of what you see when you export from CAD. You see all these, you see some quad polygons in here. That's a 4-sided polygon. And then you see a bunch of these triangles, 3-sided polygons. That's what you don't want. That's kind of bad stuff, but that's what default is exported from these CAD modelers. And it's very clean. It produces good results. But if I try to, let me fix this real quick. Otherwise it's going to drive me nuts. I can't see. There we go. So if I try to, like, I want to grab this row of polygons and I want to do what they call a loop command, which is I want to grab that row and I want it to go all the way around this part. If I hit L, it's going to go from there to there and stop. It doesn't know what to do here. It doesn't, when it gets to this triangle, it doesn't know whether it's supposed to go this way, this way, this way, this way, or if it's supposed to head up here. You know, that's where, when you have a row of polygons that are 4-sided, it's very easy to make selections and stuff in your programs. And it's very easy at that point to get good edges and stuff like that. So when I hit loop here, you'll notice that loop went all the way around. That's kind of what you want in these type of modeling systems. You don't want triangles. So a lot of the time, most of your time is spent trying to convert this stuff, or in my case, having to kind of let go of that comfort zone of CAD, jump into one of these systems where traditionally I don't model in these systems just because
it's hard, you know. So
I don't know the tools. I don't know what the tools do.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us move. You know, I came from a more CAD-like program called FormZ, and so I was very used to that kind of structure. And sub D surfaces has been a big learning process for me to think about, you know, how a sub D surface works. A subdivision surface means that you build a cage. And I don't know if Chris, it's easy for you to show, but you build a cage and it basically subdivides that cage into something softer and with more edges to it than what you have originally. And so you keep on modeling that cage, but it's actually creating something that's more detailed and has more subtlety to it. And I don't know if, so that's a so that's still a cube, but just...
Yeah, so I hit tab to do this, and you'll see that there's that corner and there's that corner. This is what they call a Catmull-Clark subdivision, and that's subdivided. Now, what subdivision surfacing, what you spend probably 80% of your time doing, is not the fun, cool stuff. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to grab these two edges here, and I'm going to do Alt-C for loop slice, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag. So helps if I'm on symmetry here. Let me back this up. So let's do this. Get our tool palette up, and mouse keeps sticking. There we go. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag these lines out so they're symmetrical. And then I'm going to do the same thing here just to kind of give you guys an overview. So Alt-C again, the loop slice, it's going to put it in the same spot. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these two and do the same thing. So what I've done is I've essentially grabbed the original edges of this square, which were here, here, and here. Oh, I didn't need that second one. Did not need that one. What I need is, I'm missing an edge here, Alex. Which one am I missing?
I'll just go ahead and soften it. They'll look at the idea.
Yeah. So what it's doing is wherever I put those lines is it's holding the edge. And now it's giving me a little bit of
grab
curvature.
onto one of those, like grab onto one of the loops. Like after you've hit tab, just grab a loop and move it.
Yep.
Like one of the,
So if I move this really close,
but move it while it's softened. While
okay,
it's
I got
on.
you.
It'll make sense.
So as we move this back and forth, it starts to curve that edge. So the further away I move, that edge is going to curve. The closer I get it now, because I don't have the other edge, it's starting to hang over.
Yeah.
But you guys kind of get the idea of what's going on here.
But yeah, so that's a subdivision. And so
yes.
and a lot of modeling that gets done these days is with subdivision surfaces. They are, I don't find them to be as precise. So as a person that comes from CAD, and I'm sure Chris has the same, it feels like, it doesn't feel like you're actually being precise in the same way, but it is, it can achieve some pretty good results.
Well, it's interesting you say that. So I went outside of my realm and I tried to get some help last week on the space logo, just for understanding a tool set. And I got in touch with a lady who works at Nike, and she does a lot of, she kind of heads up the Jordan shoe design stuff. And she spent an hour and a half on the phone with me, which I was ecstatic about it because, she didn't have to do that. Right. But one of the things that she said is she came from a very precise environment like I did. And when she got into this, she kind of just had to let that go. And she says, even now, it kind of makes her skin crawl when she's just kind of moving stuff. And it's, you don't tell it how far you want it to move. You just kind of eyeball it. So it's a mindset. It's like somebody, if you're OCD, it's like somebody moving, tilting a paper on your desk or something.
Yeah. It's like, well, it looks good. And you're like, well, and especially when you start doing stuff, because I came out of doing, if it wasn't Form Z, it was Alias Studio, and Alias Studio is designed to do cars. And you're worried about continuity across many isoprams, as you go along that, to make sure, because that's got to be perfect, or you'll see wrinkles in the reflections and so on and so forth. And so when you see sub D, you're like, I don't know how anyone could live that way, but you get used to it. And especially in little areas like the legs that we saw there, we think that it might, it produces less edges. That's the big thing. Let's jump to a couple more questions. If you have questions, go ahead. A lot of this is a context for us to answer questions and get people started on 3D. I think that 3D is going to be something that we want to add more and more in the community. And so we're going to keep on kind of walking through that. Let's go to the next question.
Sure. John Foltz in Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania says, can one capture data from an iPhone to use in 3D, for example, to scan a room for an Alex-type renovation?
Yeah, the iPhone works okay, for scanning. Now, I admit I come from a world of, we use scanners to scan stuff, and they're much higher resolution than the iPhone. But the iPhone, using something like Polycam or Sitescape, those are the two. Sitescape Pro and Polycam are the two that I've been playing with. And you get very accurate data if you have a LiDAR on the phone. It'll also texture it. I'm building an herb garden in the front of the kitchen. And instead of measuring, I just went out there and just waved my phone around, with Polycam. And now I have a whole bunch of things I can measure. I was like, okay, it's this many feet and this, and I'll measure it again probably, but I was able to just kind of draw it out. So I get a sense of it. Now, am I going to measure it with in this case, because of my phone, I'm going to go back and measure it with a regular measuring tape to make sure that it's absolutely correct before I start cutting wood. But to get an idea of what I need to order, it was very easy for me to just kind of figure it out and model it and pre-visit for my wife, for the boss. So like, this is what I'm going to do with the herb garden, and this is what it's going to look like. If I had a scanner, like everything from a BLK 360 to a Faro 350 or something like that, that data is probably more accurate than my measuring tape. So that's it. It just depends on what kind. I wouldn't say the iPhone is as good, especially in volumes. What the iPhone is really good at is objects, and that's what we'll talk about in the coming weeks. We'll talk about object capture because it's exceptionally good at that because it mixes LiDAR with photogrammetry. Next question.
Moving on to David Brady in New York City, and he says, are there similar products, Inventor, Moto, and so forth, for the Mac platform? And what are the advantages of PC over Mac in this regard?
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, the thing I mentioned earlier is what I design all this stuff for 3D printing is Tinkercad, which is browser-based. It's completely online. Works with any Mac or PC or Linux or your phone or anything, since it's based in a browser. You can move around. It's basically a much more simpler. It's a good starter 3D modeling product, because you work with primitives like these. You just drag a shape over, and then you can add or subtract. So you can bring something in that's negative, and you move it in, and it will subtract that when you combine those two things together. So you choose from basic shapes, you add them, you scale them, and it's very accurate for 3D printing. You just type in whatever dimension you want, and it will be that dimension when you print it out. It's not very good for designing stuff like our logo, where you want to apply surfaces to it and model it to make it look like a realistic 3D object. But for designing basic shapes and so on, it's pretty good at that. It stores all of your designs online, so you can, whenever you finish designing something, it saves it back to the web. For your account, it's completely free. You can log back in on a different computer, different type of computer, even on your phone, and make changes to it and output it as an OBJ or an STL file. So it's pretty handy and pretty free.
That's great. Pretty handy, pretty free. That's good. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so much like Courtney said, their Fusion 360 is also online, browser-based. And a couple terms from what Courtney was talking about there. When you take one solid and you subtract it or add it to another one, they call that a Boolean operation. And if you start on something like Tinkercad, you'll be ahead of the game when you go into something like Moto or Cinema 4D or Blender, because they use Boolean operations to do a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. So don't consider something like Tinkercad to be, low rent, because it's a very good, you can learn a lot from understanding how that works.
Yeah. And from a modeling perspective, I think that you can do most of everything that you want to do. There are definitely some apps that are only available on the PC. So, AutoCAD and some of the other apps. Moto is cross-platform. Chris uses it on a PC, but it's cross-platform. I primarily use Cinema 4D, and that is cross-platform, and then Blender is cross-platform. So there's a lot of things that are working on both ends. I will say that I currently prefer the Mac overall because of my pipeline is so USDZ driven, and having an operating system that supports it makes it a lot easier for me to just, I can literally on the Mac, you can double click on a USDZ object and it just opens up in preview, and you can just rotate it around and you can see it there. So I think that the Mac is a little bit simpler if you are thinking about AR or delivering to USDZ, and that's like 90% of what I'm trying to deliver to is USDZ. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so on the PC side, that's what I use. Part of the reason I do this on the PC is when I bought my big machine up there, I bought it because I had 4 graphics cards in it.
Yep.
Something you can't do on the Mac side. But the render farms are so cheap now that I would never do that again. I could have bought 4 machines and had 4 things going for what I paid for this. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to have multiple cards in your machine. If you can find a way to secure a 3090, that'd be awesome. But just check out the render farms, because they're very, very useful.
And we're going to build, we're in the process over the next couple of weeks. We have a bunch of PCs at 09 that don't get used every day. And so we're going to turn those into a 16 machine render farm for cinema. So that'll be something that we can kind of deliver renders to. And the reason is that I'm working on building really complex countdown clocks for office hours, and I started rendering them out of Cinema, and I was like, wow, this is going to take a long time. Like, it was taking like an hour a frame for some of the stuff I was doing, and I was like, I probably need to get more computers and more time. So anyways, so we're going to be putting that in the not too distant future. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, the other thing is that it depends on how long you've been doing this. As someone who has been doing this for a long time, I was used to rendering in very small little preview squares and keeping things at very low resolution, because my computer was, I had 192 megabytes of RAM to work with when I worked on Star Wars. Next question.
Alex 4D Gollner in London is up next. He says, is there a standalone place in Discord where we can have the Adobe Illustrator Photoshop PDF versions of the flat version of the office hours logo?
We should probably have a kind of a work in progress thing of the logo somewhere. But let me I gotta work on a couple things there first. And then let me work on a couple things there, and then we'll post it in Discord so that and we'll have to have somewhere that's pinned that says this is the current version. Like current version is this name, because we'll keep on probably iterating a little bit. Next question.
Stephen Montagna of Madison, Wisconsin's up next, and he says, what is your controller setup, mouse, trackball, stream deck, or so forth, for doing 3D work? Are there certain peripherals you use just for these kinds of projects?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so I use this. This is a Logitech trackball. And the reason I use this is I have two 43-inch monitors. So when I'm drawing a line from one side to the other, at least this is how it used to be, if I had a traditional mouse, I would notice that my arm all of a sudden was over here when I'm finished drawing a line. So the trackball just stays right there. But a lot of people choose to use these things. These are 3D Connection space mouse. This will allow you to rotate and zoom in and out and kind of work with your model all at the same time. I can't stand using these things. You really have to get used to them. And I should have just forced myself to do it, but I just use the keyboard shortcuts on the keyboard to rotate and pan. So,
yeah, I think that I know some people that use Wacom tablets the whole time. Like, a friend of mine uses that when he's modeling. He just uses a Wacom tablet to do it, and he seems to like it a lot. A lot of people who use ZBrush, and we'll get somebody to come in and talk about ZBrush in the not too distant future. I know a lot of people that will use Wacom tablets there because you're really painting on the geometry. And Nick, what interfaces do you use for it? Just a mouse?
I'm usually using a standard 3-button mouse, but Wacom tablets are another go-to.
Yeah.
They're definitely more ergonomic.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. Next question.
Comes from our Eduardo Augustine in Panama, and he said, would these same concepts be applied to augmented reality, perhaps LiDAR, to create lines in the real world?
Yeah, so we are building these with AR as a consideration. So a lot of the objects that we're building are stuff that we want to put into AR. One of the big challenges with AR is polygonal count. So if you are our logo is not very complicated in the grand scheme of things. It's complicated to model, Chris, yeah, but not complicated as far as heavy geometry. And so what we find is that if you're building something that's going to be available for the last couple years of phones, Apple phones right now, because that's where most of our AR is getting done. 2 million polygons is kind of the outer edge of what we can put in and have it want to render back correctly. And it has a self-built limit inside of most of the services of 50 megs. So if the file is bigger than 50 megabytes, it just won't let you do it. It's too big. So you have to, but you can literally text someone. You can, using just messages, you can just like text someone a 3D model and it'll come at scale to them. And so that works pretty well. But yeah, the LiDAR on the phone becomes extremely powerful in the area of AR because it knows what the scene is. So it knows exactly what scale to put it at. It doesn't have to figure it out because the LiDAR is giving it back scale from the real scene. So if you give it something at scale, it's going to be able to put your object into scale and also handle occlusion, which means it can see, oh, your couch is in front. So I'm going to put that in front of your 3D object as well. So there's a lot of power that the LiDAR has. Next question.
Comes from Douglas Carmichael. And Douglas asks, how can you extrude the flat logo to a model you can use in Cinema 4D?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so if you give me just a second, I'll show him real quick.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so I'm in Inventor. I'm not in Cinema, but I'm in Inventor. So all I'm going to do, Douglas, is I brought the logo in, the chopped up logo as a graphic on a sketch plane, and I've created another sketch plane right on top of that. So I'm just going to grab the circle tool, and I'm going to, let's say we'll just drag that out. I'm going to hit E for extrude. And, this is going to be fairly easy here if my keyboard would cooperate. which it's not. So we'll go over here and hit extrude. So it's going to find the closed circle, and it's just going to extrude, and then I can just drag this up and down. So that's step one. Step two is to sketch back on that surface of what I just extruded. And we'll just do this real quick. I'm not going to put any like precise stuff in here. We're just going to, normally that outer edge would be curved, but I'm just going to do that. I'm going to hit extrude again, rotate around, and then just tell that to, I'm missing a window here. Where did it go? Okay, well, we're just going to tell that to go this way and hit enter. So what I've got now, if I turn these two off, is you've got the makings of the start of that logo.
And then you can, to get back to Boolean, you could merge these if you wanted to.
Well, they're one solid right now.
Oh, you did do it that way. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So by default, it automatically merges unless you tell it not to. So, but what I can do is I can grab, now I should have mentioned this earlier. This is the biggest difference between CAD and a polygonal modeler, is you'll notice I have this browser over here, and I can drag this end apart up and down. And what it's doing is it's giving me a hierarchy of what I built. So first I did that extrusion, then I did this extrusion, then I'm going to grab a circular array. I'm going to grab that little gear. I'm going to pick this, which is going to give me the center of that circle. And then I just tell it how many I want. So I want 6. So it's built 3 things here, and I can go back and change those anytime I want. And here's an example of why I use CAD and why it's so fast. Is this is something that these polygonal modelers do not have. This is a parameters window. And Fusion 360 kind of has this, but it doesn't. But if you look down here at the bottom, you may or may not be able to read this, but it says circular pattern number 6. If I change that to 12, watch what happens. Now, that's a powerful thing. So I'm going to check this little box here that says key, and then I'm going to go over to this iLogic thing, and I'm going to give me 1 second here, show you how powerful this is. I'm going to grab that one in. I'm going to pull it right there. Hit OK. Now I can keep this little form up, and at any time I can change that. So when Alex says, hey, I need to change this, and I know that the thing in question might be how thick this thing is, I map it right here and I just go back and change it. But in this case, we're just putting the number of, spokes that are on there. So it's a very powerful tool. CAD is a very powerful tool. Don't count it out for just because you want to have something sub-D'd, because you can always bring this in as a starting shape and then shrink down to it. But this is very fast. CAD's very fast.
Yeah, go ahead, Courtney.
Getting back to the original question, does the software you just demonstrated there have the ability to bring in a bitmap like a logo and to select something based on its color, for example, to convert that bitmap to an outline, to paths automatically, and then extrude?
It does not, which has been something we've been requesting for over 12 years.
You could do that in Adobe Illustrator, convert a bitmap to paths, I guess, and then bring it in as an AI file.
Photo and Cinema 4D and Blender, you can bring in Illustrator files, and if you can affect their edges and the stroke and all that stuff. So there's pros and cons to all these, and I wish there would be a marriage one day of CAD and polygonal in the same thing. There's not.
And and Nick, do you have access to the back end, the panel view? Just not sure.
At the moment, I don't actually.
Okay. But you have to be careful when you convert in an Illustrator from a bitmap because it doesn't draw the lines very well. So it does the best it can. It's like, oh, I got curves and stuff like that, but it might throw a ton of points in some area because that's how it's trying to figure out what that is. And then what happens is all those little lines that Chris was talking about becomes really problematic. So a computer converted raster to a vector, then extruded, oftentimes doesn't render very well. And so you end up with a lot of idiosyncrasies. And so most of us retrace those, all the time. And you think that, oh, I'll let it auto do it and then I'll clean it up, and it's just faster to retrace it. So you just, and I've done incredibly complicated. Now I grew up in print, so I we traced everything by hand. So, the Bezier tool is a friend of ours, so you can do it relatively quickly once you're comfortable with knowing how it wants to react. Go ahead, Nick.
Thanks. I was just going to share that a lot of Polygon tools today do have these features. They're often called procedural or instances. So Maya, Blender, Cinema 4D, and even Unreal Engine will have these kinds of things. And so you can actually say you wanted to build a subway tunnel. You could define the rules of what that subway tunnel would be. There's going to be these walls, and randomly you want utility boxes and piping and all that sort of thing. And essentially you could drag out a Bezier curve and shape that curve any way you like. And the track will be there, and it'll put in the ties across the track. And so a lot of this has been built into Polygon tools. Houdini is another application that, works in this space. And the term over there now is procedural, and that you basically set up the rules and you can adjust those rules as you deem necessary.
Yeah, we're gonna bring somebody on for one of our 3D things from Houdini, just to show you Houdini. Houdini is this scary tool to learn, but it is incredibly powerful. Like, it's just like this incredible, like, it's just mind-bending procedural based. Like, they have these L systems that you just say, I just want plants all over this thing, and there's a set of, as Chris said, there's a set of rules that you go by. Go ahead, Chris. Chris Fritsche.
Yeah, I was gonna say, for the back to the Illustrator thing. The only time that I use where I allow Illustrator to trace it is if I'm just going to use that image like in a 2D thing. If I have to export that out to CAD or Modo or something like that, I always have to just redraw it because those lines have to be one continuous line.
Yeah.
But
next question.
Alex 40 Goldner in London, England says, tell us about SDR, HDR considerations.
Go ahead, Alex. Oh, can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I imagine that this is not really the modeling part, but it's bearing in mind, say we want to have part of this logo actually be emitting light or lens effects and stuff like that, and glints. So what are the issues there when SDR versus HDR?
Some of the renderers are actually able to set it so you can literally render out as BT 2020 or different log formats and so on and so forth. So the renderers will have that as a capability. You really, if you have enough bit depth, so most of these will also render out at 16-bit. The depth can be 16 bits, and at that point you can just send it out linear, and then you can apply that curve later, because 16 bits per pixel is an enormous amount of color that's available. And so you have all the color that you need to transform it any way you want later. So when you're rendering out, you can render out, like, for instance, every frame can be rendered out as a 16-bit TIFF, and now you have just enormous amounts of data to work with. And so you can just do it linearly if you want to that way, or some of them will also render out in curves. I prefer to just send it out linearly and then make the adjustment, after that, because I don't have to worry about that right now. So you can always apply, because you can then take it into something like Resolve and say, I'm going to now convert it from the Rec 709 space or the linear space to another curve, and you're going to get what you came for there. But most of the modern ones will let you also render out, and we're going to be experimenting with a lot of that. One of the things that I'm working on right now in my copious free time is building a rule-based countdown clock. So using MoGraph in Cinema 4D, setting it up so that at first I was going to do it from text, and I will show it as soon as we have it working, but I was going to do it from like a text generator, but I've decided I want to make it an object generator. So here are your 10 objects that are the 10 objects that are going to be your numbers, and then they're going to flow through. That way I can make anything I want, in those areas, and they might be text, but they might be something else. So we'll talk about that in the future. But when we start rendering all of this stuff, we'll show people the results, because it'll be going out in HDR. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's up next, and he says, Inventor is incredible. Can it run on the Mac?
Chris?
Nope. But Fusion 360, which is 85 to 90% of Inventor can.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'll help anybody who wants to download it. You just find me on office hours.
Yeah, I will say that when it comes to CAD programs, the PC is much more common in the CAD world and BIM world. So you're going to see, some deeper tools in that area. You can definitely do entertainment style 3D really, really easily. If you're going to really do AutoCAD and a lot of the heavier lifting, most of us still use PCs for that.
AutoCAD's on a Mac, just not Inventor.
AutoCAD, does it really run on a Mac? Well,
they have a Mac version. Let me just say that.
Okay, all right. Next, I've never seen anybody use it in the real world on a Mac. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's back in with, did the Office Hours logo come from the earlier Gear Media Tech logo used in the PCX era?
Yeah, it is. It's based roughly on that, but there obviously we made some adjustments to it as we move forward. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael, what 3D tool would you use to visualize 2D scientific data sets? For example, could you do that in C4D, Cinema 4D?
Go ahead, Chris.
I'm not sure what he means by scientific data sets, but I'll show you this real quickly. It'll be really fast. This was something I was working on with Tyler, and what CAD does over what the polygonal modelers do is that we kind of have access to doing finite element analysis. So I've readjusted the load here to be 60,000 pounds on this thing, but we're going to simulate what this design would look like, and it usually runs really fast here.
And so what this is actually doing is in a finite element analyzer, you have, and this has been around for a long time, you're giving those objects the actual, like, this is made of steel, or this is made of this, or these are the coefficients, so to speak. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm telling it here, I'll rotate it again. So I'm telling it that these legs are welded, that these legs are on an immovable object such as the ground. That yellow triangle you kind of see right there, that's gravity. I put 60,000 pounds on it. Now this is giving you the von Mies. I could look at all this stuff, but this is
you could make that force smaller, right? So that it's 60,000 pounds not across the entire top.
Yeah, it's distributed across the entire top.
But if you didn't, it would look much different. I'm guessing.
Well, this is 2x3 tubing. I mean, this would.
But I'm saying if you made that force half as long, and 60,000 pounds, it would just
you wouldn't see this. Now this is over exaggerated,
right?
Because let me look at my displacement here.
And while Chris is working on that, go ahead, Nick.
And it depends also on the nature of the scientific data that you're trying to represent. Houdini is one of those tools that often gets used for that. So you could have a vast amount of data. You could be, doing simulations in MATLAB and things like that are used in the scientific and engineering side of things, and take all of that data into tools like Houdini. Houdini in feature film visual effects is used to create a lot of the, oceans flowing through cities and huge explosions with lots of smoke and debris and buildings falling down, because it's procedural. You can set up the rules for what are the tensile strengths of concrete and steel and gravel and things like that. And it'll simulate all of those interactions. And so there's quite a few scientific documentaries that are illustrating weather patterns across the surface of the earth and magnetic and plasma flows around the sun that are routinely visualized through the use of Houdini, because it's designed to handle vast amounts of data that, is volumetric in nature, voxels instead of a single pixel that's X and Y, it's XYZ, a volume pixel, and data can pass between all of those. And so it's really powerful for that.
Nick, I got to ask, is that you or a metahuman you? When you're out of the black.
Metahuman me.
Did you want, we're running out of time. I have a hard out. Chris, did you have anything else to add to that before we jump?
Yeah, I was just going to show you that you can. This is just simulating what that would be. Obviously, it wouldn't do this because I have cross supports here. But what this is showing is the stress factors, and this is in inches. So anything that's red has deformed by 3.7 inches, but anything that's in blue is less than a 16th. Now they over exaggerated here so you can actually see that it moved. But with 60,000 pounds on that, he was asking for his washer and dryer. I think we've covered that.
I can tell you that this has been around since the mid 80s when I was in high school. And if you really want to manipulate and win lots of physics challenges in school, having access to a finite element analyzer is super useful. Anyway,
get that with Fusion 360 too, just to let you know.
That's great. Yeah. So I would if any kids are watching, It's really good for the bridge project, just in case you're wondering. There's the bridge project is much easier after you've worked through it in a finite element analyzer. Last question.
Last question. Douglas Carmichael says, let's say you wanted to fly through DEM map data. Could you do it in CAD 4D? Cinema 4D.
Cinema 4D. Yeah, you can. You have to convert it to some file format. I don't think that Cinema can bring in DEMs directly. It might be. Oh, no, I think it actually can. I think you can import DEMs directly into it. That's a digital elevation map, usually generated by the USGS. And I believe that the DEMs can be imported directly. Otherwise, I used to sell a converter to DXF and OBJs. I have to jump really quickly here. Chris, thank you for being our first 3D tour. We might try to bring you on and have you show more things about the logo because we didn't get to all of them. We answered all these questions and we didn't show all the pieces. But we'll bring you on maybe in a little while to give us an update on how it's going, and we'll probably be using it in the not too distant future. But Chris, thanks so much for prepping and being here available for this.
Yeah, after hours is good for a lot of that stuff too.
Chris just models in after hours. Like he literally just you'll see him just working away. And sometimes he's actually using a 3D program. Sometimes he's just going like this, just for pictures when he's modeling there. Anyway, so it's really good to see him work there. And thanks to our producers for all the great questions, and our panelists, of course, for sharing the wealth of knowledge. And we'll now see you in after hours. Stay tuned.